what I'm going to be talking about is a little bit about what museums do. So we take archaeology. So for example, in this particular case, I'm dealing with a project called Diving Deep, HMS Invincible 1744, which is about a shipwreck has been excavated in the Solent. She sank in 1758, and she was one of the very first HMS Invincibles. There were 4 in total. So what we have to do as a museum is interpret that archaeology for the public. And it's a little bit more complicated than you might imagine. So for example, the simplest way of showing how complicated it can be is if you imagine a grandfather with his granddaughter, 5-year-old granddaughter, comes to visit the exhibition on this shipwreck. How do we engage the grandfather, who might have had a career in diving, for example, and the granddaughter, who might have difficulty reading text at the same time? So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we interpret things in museums. One of the traditional ways of interpreting archaeology is to put the objects onto shelves, into exhibition cases, with a nice neat label underneath that explains what the object is. Now, that means that the public look at that object, they completely accept what that object is, you know, they accept the label as verbatim, as truth, and they have no idea about the context in which it was found, how it was found, and so on, and the interpretation of the science that's gone on behind the scenes. Now, I want to be able to show the public that element in order to help the public be able to challenge interpretations and so on. You'll see later on, because quite often archaeology challenges our interpretations about our understanding of our history. I'm going to start with the first screen. So one of the ways in which we interpret this wreck to the public is not just an exhibition, it's also with outreach. Creating an exhibition takes time. So we started the project by actually physically going out to the public at events and so on with objects and started talking to them. But then, of course, COVID-19 happened, which is extremely confusing. It's caused a whole load of difficulties, lots of predicaments, and I thought I might share with you some of the things that I've been doing to try and solve those predicaments. So, for example, if we can't physically go out and talk to people, how do we start talking to the public? How do we do that outreach when we're all locked down in our homes? So obviously we had to take our outreach online. Now, I was locked down rather quickly. If you remember, it happened very, very quickly. So I was stuck at home with a few objects, but none of the usual tools that I would use to explain the objects and where they come from and the context, the archaeological context in which they came from. So I'm going to show you what I did to try and solve that problem. So I'm just going to go back to my webcam so that I can see what I'm doing. So I'm hoping that everybody can see me and have made me large, so that because I'm going to concentrate on the webcam at the moment. So one of the first things, the interesting things about this archaeological site, this HMS Invincible, if you remember, it's 1758. So we're talking Georgian sailing navy. And of course, in the Georgian period, there were slightly what we would consider strange fashions. And we found quite a lot of these on a warship. So it's actually broken in half. So you would have had a symmetrical element to the exact other side. And it's essentially a wig curler. Now, people understand what curlers are, but they get a bit confused when you add the term wig to it. So the simplest way I could find of explaining a wig curler without having an 18th century replica wig to show people was to use something like this, which was my toilet roll wig. Ooh. Just want to put my webcam back so I can see what I'm doing. So as you can see, I've used, he's slightly lopsided, toilet rolls to demonstrate where the wig curls might go. And these are the crazy things that you end up having to do when you're stuck at home and trying to invent ways of explaining the archaeology and explaining the science. So the next one is explaining a bit more about the science. So I asked the public what the connection between a leather shoe found under the seabed on the Invincible wreck, so buried underneath the seabed. You can see that that's the sole of the leather shoe, beautifully preserved. Something like this, you would normally, if you buried this in your back garden, it would have rotted away very, very quickly. So what's the connection between the leather shoe buried under the seabed and a tin of beans? You can write your answers in your question section. Peter, has anyone come up with an answer? What's the connection between a leather shoe and a tin of beans? The clue is it's buried under the seabed.
I haven't received any answers yet.
Okay.
But some people need to make the webcam bigger.
Yeah, so we've got tin of beans and a leather shoe. So that's the sole.
Aha, we have an answer. So someone said that the beans and the shoe are connected by a lack of oxygen.
Perfect, brilliant. So the fact that your beans don't rot, you know, if we were to keep this on our shelf, in fact, in the National Museum of the Royal Navy, we have in our collection a tin of Christmas pudding that's over 100 years old. So you know, a tin will actually preserve the contents for a very long time because there's no oxygen in it. And the same can be said for underneath the seabed. So we're not just talking the sand layer at the bottom of the seabed, but actually underneath the sand layer, there's a beautiful, thick, sticky, gooey clay layer there, which is a really good anaerobic environment. That's what the terminology that we use for that. And that's how I explained it to the public when I'm stuck at home. And actually, it makes so much sense that I might carry on using the tin of beans to demonstrate this. Another example is we're talking about a wooden ship that was captured from the French. It was actually built in France, and we captured it, and then we refitted it to fit British regulations back in the 1750s. So I asked the public about tree rings, and this is because the archaeologists started using dendrochronology to test various elements, various timbers on the wreck. And helping the public to understand what dendrochronology is, I use things like this. So I'm hoping that you can all see that nice and clearly. Let's see if I can put it in the sun. So can you see the tree rings? Can anyone tell me, what does a tree ring represent for that tree, essentially? Peter, has there anyone typing at the moment?
Not at the present moment. We've got a lot of people getting the correct answer for your previous question. And lots of people asking about the webcam bigger. There is a grey bar in between the webcam section and the presentation. If you just slide it up and down, it will make one bigger and one smaller. And unfortunately, if you're on a phone, I'm not sure what you can do about that. The answers for your tree ring question is lots of people are getting the correct answer. It's 1 year of growth.
Yeah, so, absolutely. So the tree ring represents the growth season. So essentially that's the summer in a year. And then we have different size tree rings. So if I show you again, I'm hoping you can see that fairly clearly. Some tree rings are fatter than other tree rings. And does anyone have any idea why you might have different size tree rings? If it represents 1 year of growth, you know, that's like a calendar. Why might they differ in size? Have you got any answers coming up?
I think people are typing, hopefully. Yes, we have one answer. Each ring is a year of growth, and the relative sizes can be matched to it's to do with the environment and rainfall, good and bad summers.
Yeah, so perfect. So you might have good and bad summers. You also might have longer summers. So for example, summers in Hampshire might last longer than summers in Scotland. You know, the growing season will be different because Hampshire is warmer than Scotland. So tree rings represent not only can we date things from tree rings, but we can also actually work out where the tree grew. So basically, on this particular ship, we were interested in not only the age of the timbers, when was that tree chopped down, but also where did that tree grow? Is it a French timber or is it a British timber? And that helps us to understand which parts of the ship were refitted by the British. Very useful piece of information, but also quite complex science, and helping the public to understand that online can be quite complex. Okay, so I'm going to go back to my slides. I'm going to talk a little bit now about the exhibition itself and how we actually have to design in certain elements. So when you're designing an exhibition, let's ignore the fact that, you know, pandemics and so on. You'd have to consider things like human behavior. What do people actually physically do in a space? What are people's learning preferences? So if you remember, the grandfather's learning preference might be very, very different to the 5-year-old child's learning preference. Engagement and appeal, again, certain things will appeal to some people and other things will appeal to others, and age differences might also have a factor in that. We've got things like physical layout. So this exhibition is going into an 18th century warehouse, and we have things like pillars that hold up the roof that get in the way and so on. So it's actually, how can you physically fit in this exhibition into the space? And then a very important consideration is public safety. Now, originally that was to do with making sure that people didn't trip over things and get too squashed in certain areas as they walk around. But then, of course, the pandemic happened, and public safety actually had a whole new meaning around how they could physically go around this exhibition. This exhibition is about a shipwreck, and it's not just about the shipwreck itself, it's also about the excavation of a shipwreck. And the majority of the public would have no idea what it's like to excavate an underwater site. Most members of the public don't dive. I can't dive, for example. So helping the public to understand what it feels like to be down there on the wreck was an important element of this exhibition. So this exhibition was touchy and feely and very, very much sensory. So if it's touchy and feely, what on earth are we going to do during a pandemic when touching things can actually spread diseases? So what we came up with, we've got lots of objects in there that we couldn't necessarily disinfect every time anyone touched it. For example, you can't disinfect a dive suit. It's not made of plastic. You can't just wipe it down. So we came up with the idea that if we can't disinfect the objects, we need to disinfect the people. And we didn't want to make it scary and sort of, you know, biohazardy, because you remember, you are dealing with families. You don't want to scare children. You want to make them feel relaxed, feel engaged, and also engage in the activity of disinfecting themselves in order to increase people's adherence to this process. So what we did is, you can see here, I'm hoping that my cursor actually might be able to see Peter. Peter, can you see my cursor on the screen?
I can indeed, yes.
Brilliant. So here, as this is a design element, we decided to create hand sanitizers, and so hand sanitizer dispensers, and each dispenser would be linked to a character in the exhibition. So this one here is linked to a diver in the exhibition, or it might be linked to a conservator, or it might even be linked to the captain of the ship, or it might even be linked to a gribble or a shipworm that's eating the ship. So we encourage people to choose their character and then go and hunt for the hand sanitizer dispensers that relate to their character and squirt their hands every time they find one. Now, what we've done is we've absolutely filled the exhibition with hand sanitizers. So anywhere you touch anything, there will be hand sanitizers nearby for people to actually hand sanitize. And we encourage people to hand sanitize before they touch and also after they touch. So basically it's lashings of 70% alcohol, which gives the conservators a bit of a heart attack, but there's nothing we can do to avoid that at the moment. We have also got things like access. We have to consider access for disability groups. So for example, if this is a sensory exhibition and we're trying to recreate what it's like to be underneath the water, diving on the wreck, we created a 180-degree film, so it surrounds you of the exhibition itself, of the divers working on the exhibition. Now, when you're diving, there's not very much chat going on. There isn't, so, you know, we chat on the surface quite a lot. So you hear a lot of people talking, but when you're diving, what you hear is very different. And also what you feel. So the film had a soundscape rather than a narrative. And what do we do with people who are hearing impaired if the soundscape is the core of the exhibition? It sort of spreads out over the exhibition, so you hear it from wherever you are. So the way we dealt with that was we decided we needed to describe the sound, and we didn't want to do it in a boring way, you know, bubbles rising, the sound of bubbles rising. We felt that was a little bit boring and not very creative when the rest of the exhibition was very creative. So we decided to commission a poet to describe the sound using poetry. And instead of subtitles, you will see the poem on the screen describing the sound for people who are hearing impaired. And also facing people, you know, people who are visually impaired as well. The screen is enormous. It's from floor to ceiling, and it surrounds you in an 18th century warehouse, so you can imagine how high it is. But we also decided to create sensory seating, because when you're diving, I don't dive, but I do swim, and when you're down there, the sound that you hear is much more about your breathing, vibrations around you, so you feel sound, you don't just hear it. So we decided to put into the sensory seating what is described as a butt kicker. A bit strange, but that's what they describe it as. A butt kicker is something that you put, normally drummers in bands would use a butt kicker. It's linked to their seat so that they can feel their drums, because the sound of the band is so loud that they can't necessarily hear them. So we're going to link a butt kicker to the sound of the exhibition, so that when you sit on the sensory seating, you feel the vibrations around you, not just hear it. And we hope that enable people with access needs to be able to engage with something with the film as well. So we also needed to actually encourage the public to ask questions of us and to challenge our interpretation, because interpretation can often once we get an idea into our heads and it's displayed in a museum, then it kind of gets repeated over and over again in exhibition after exhibition after exhibition. So a classic one is this one. So the concept of the Marines on board Invincible. The Marines are well known as being redcoats. They're described as redcoats. And this is a classic modern interpretation of 18th century redcoats. So there they are in their uniform, and it's a red coat. Okay, so I'm going to go back to my webcam and get myself up there. Now, do we think it might not necessarily be what we think? So 18th century red might not necessarily be what we consider red to be. So we kind of consider a red coat to be like fire engine red. But actually on the Invincible, in the archaeology doesn't bear that out. The archaeology actually shows us this. So I'm going to hold it up. I hope you can all see that. That is not fire engine red. That's much more a sort of maroon colour. Now, the only people wearing red on the ship at the time would have been the Marines. So what we're looking at here is a maroon marine coat rather than a red marine coat. But they would have seen it as red, because the concept of fire engine red, so if we go back to the slide, this very, very bright red was not actually invented until the Industrial Revolution, because it's a synthetic dye. It is not a natural dye. So in that time period, red meant something different. So red to them is what we would consider maroon, and that's borne out by painting. So we've got examples here. So this is, I think this is George the Second and George III, or no, George III and George IV, both of which you can see they're wearing red. But you can see that it's much more in tune with the material that we found on the Invincible, that sort of slightly duller, slightly more maroon colour than actually bright fire engine red that we see as redcoats. We also have mystery objects. So this is something that was found on the wreck. It is made from bamboo, a large piece of bamboo, so it is an exotic material. It would not have grown in this country to that size. So it's quite clear it's been collected either in the Caribbean or in Asia, and it's been turned into what looks like some kind of scoop, but we're not quite sure. So we could put it on display and say it's possibly a scoop, and then the public will always interpret it as a scoop. However, what I'm going to try and ask the public to do is to actually work out what they think it is, to tell us what they think it is, because we genuinely don't know what this is. We know that it was found on the wreck. We know it was found quite high up in the layers, so it could have actually, it might not even be from this wreck, it could have been dumped on the wreck from another ship. We know it's fairly old, so we're not talking Victorian, it's possibly 18th century. It's in poor condition, it's been nibbled on by gribble and shipworm and so on. But we're going to ask the public several questions. What is it? And is it from this wreck? Could it be from another wreck? Or just rubbish tipped overboard that happened to end up on top of the ship? So it's trying to encourage the public to ask us questions, to challenge the interpretation that we come up with. And I feel that that's extremely important at a time like this, when, you know, basically the government is asking us to develop our own interpretations of, for example, the science of COVID-19, and risk assess ourselves, follow rules, but really complex rules, and interpret them in our own way. And I think that's a skill that should be encouraged, and encourage people to challenge us as archaeologists and museums.